Hey guys, Jason Slama with another episode of GWENT Guides. This video will focus on helping you build a kick-ass deck. In order to master deck building, it is important for you to know how you expect your deck to perform over the rounds. To do this, it's crucial to understand how round strategies work in GWENT, so if you haven't watched that video, I highly recommend you start there. Building decks can be quite overwhelming, especially if you're starting out and are not familiar with most cards and strategies. If you are feeling frustrated, try and take comfort in the fact that this is a skill you can learn over time. Fortunately, the starter decks provided to players serve as quite strong jumping points into deck building. They are in themselves quite good while having lots of room to grow as you do. I therefore highly recommend starting your deck building journey by modifying one of these starter decks instead of creating one from scratch. After we go through some techniques and terminology of deck building, I'll take you through the process of taking the monster starter deck and making it stronger. For now, let's review the basics. A deck consists of 25 or more cards. While you can technically add more than 25 cards, I don't recommend doing this as this reduces the consistency of your deck. What I mean by this is that there are more cards in your deck, the more likely you are not going to get your best card in a match, and this can be the difference between victory and defeat. A deck must also contain at least 13 unit cards. This limitation was added to prevent players from making unitless decks that were just too uninteractive to play against. Normally, you should not run into an issue here, but it's worth mentioning. Deck building in GWENT gets more complex with the last restriction is addressed: provisions. Each card has a provision cost, the lowest being 4. Generally speaking, lower provision cards are considered less powerful than higher provision cards, in a vacuum at least. Practically speaking, lower provision cards tend to be worth a matching value in provision with conditions allowing them to attain higher value. Higher provision cards tend to be less efficient with their provisions, but are generally worth more points. Your deck has a limit of the number of provisions it can support, starting at 150, with leader abilities adding to this base limit. This is how those leader abilities are balanced relative to each other. The art of deck building in GWENT revolves around a balancing act of card provisions. For example, you can swap 2 5 provision cards for a 4 and a 6 provision card. Your provision value of one card is lower, but in exchange you can add a higher provision card. Cards often fall into one of several categories. Engine cards are cards that generate value over time. These are often best played earlier in a round to gain maximum effect and are often targets for your opponent's attacks. It is also important to understand how your engines work in order to get their maximum value. For example, the Nausicaa Sergeant will continue to grow in value as long as you play cards with deploy abilities. It's therefore important to add plenty of cards with such deploy abilities to your deck to get the most value out of your Nausicaa Sergeant. Otherwise, it might be worth considering not adding them to your deck at all. Another good example is the Lyrian Arbalist, who gains a charge whenever a card with an order ability is played. Its potential value over a long round is quite high, much over its provision limit. However, it requires your deck to have enough order cards to play. Removal cards focus in destroying enemy cards. Removal cards also tend to focus on higher damage, so they are more capable of getting rid of most units, and they pay a premium in provision for this ability. For example, Geralt Professional can be seen as a 3 power, 3 damage card for 11 provisions. This card's provision cost is higher due to its potential to deal significantly more damage and remove an opponent's key card. Soft removal cards exist in the form of lock and movement cards. These disable your opponent's engine by making their ability non-functional, but in a way that can be undone. For locked units, a simple Purify ability will remove the lock status, and when you move in an engine that can only work on a specific row, they can always be moved back. When playing with your deck, Knowing how many removal options you have and what targets to use them on is the key to victory. Removing an engine before it can grow can have long-term impact on your opponent's game plan. Thinning cards are cards that focus on taking cards out of your deck. These can be incredibly valuable if played properly and early, as they increase the odds of you being able to use your strongest cards. Some are straightforward, such as Impera Brigade, while others, such as Erlen, is more complex in their requirements. Some cards help thin cards for a specific category. For example, John Natalis lets you pull a Warfare card from your deck. Make sure to try to always keep a Warfare card when considering mulligans, so you are capable of playing it with John Natalis. These kinds of thinning cards add an extra punch to your special cards, while potentially giving you a choice of which one to play from your deck. However, you need to be careful with thinning cards, as having both copies in your hand is a really unfortunate scenario. That is why it is best to try and play them in earlier rounds to remove the risk of this happening in later rounds. Mulligans can save you when you draw both copies in your opening hand. Remember, you can also save this combo in earlier rounds with the goal to mulligan one back into your deck in later rounds. I highly recommend you always keep at least one or two ways to thin your deck. Tech and utility cards are usually low value in a vacuum, but can make a critical difference when playing against specific decks. These are cards that tend to gain or lose value in your deck depending on the meta you are facing, meaning which deck your opponent is playing. For example, Lambert's Swordmaster does 2 damage to a card and all of its copies. In most scenarios, he's at best an 8 to 10 point play for 9 provisions. Though not that bad, it will often not be the type of power play you expect from such a high provision card. However, if you are often stuck playing against decks that spawn many copies of a specific card, such as Erka Swarm or Congregate decks, which spawn many cards, Lambert can be a devastating card that plays a key role in securing your victory. Grimace is another example of a tech card that allows you to purify away negative status effects from your cards, or positive effects such as Defender from your opponent's units. While on paper, his value may seem low, his ability to disrupt your opponent's strategy can be quite valuable in certain matchups. For example, if you are encountering many opponents applying bounty status to your units, Grimace can easily remove bounty, drawing out a critical source of income from your opponent. Finisher cards are cards capable of doing massive point shifts in your favor when played. Often, you will want to save these cards as your last play to either maximize its effect or minimize the risk your opponent will counter its value. Regis is a good example and deals 1 damage to all enemies in a row, repeating this effect if any unit is destroyed. He is capable of doing crazy amounts of damage to your opponent and gains value the more cards your opponent places in a row. Thus, he's often saved until the end of a long round after you've had a chance to damage your opponent's units in such a way that Regis will do his abilities several times. Glusty Warp is another example that destroys all 1 power units and boosts himself by 2 for each unit destroyed. It's important to note that this includes enemy units as well. Combined with Erika Swarm, he can easily be worth 16 or more points that your opponent wasn't ready for. However, he is incredibly vulnerable to cards designed to destroy high power units like Geralt of Rivia. This is why he's often best used to say last say, so your opponent cannot touch him. With understanding of these card categories, we can delve deeper into types of decks you can build. Engine decks, unsurprisingly, are decks that contain almost exclusively engine cards or cards that help engines survive or grow faster. Control decks often contain almost exclusively removal cards. These decks often have 1 or 2 strong finisher cards and are vulnerable to not being able to generate many points themselves. Hybrid decks are often a healthy mix of both engine and removal cards and tend to be the most flexible. Regardless of which type of deck you are building, you should always consider saving a slot or two for tech cards that can help you deal with strategies that are often troubling you. It is important to also remember that Gwent is played over 3 rounds, and thus saving only one finisher card or combo in your deck is incredibly risky. You have to win 2 rounds after all. There's also the random nature of card games to consider. Relying only on one strong combo or finisher leaves you vulnerable to not having access to it at all during the match. Armed with this knowledge, let us try and modify the monster starter deck one card at a time to make it better. After playing the deck for a while, I got the feeling that Osril was a nice finisher if I could play him off my old spear tip asleep in the earlier rounds. Luckily, the starter deck has extra unused provisions, so for now it is very easy to look at the higher provision cards to add in. In my search, I quickly discover that there is another old spear tip card worth 12 points. A juicy target for my Osril indeed. I decide to add it and remove a Wild Hunt Navigator as I find them to be one of the weakest cards I have access to. Looking at my provision limit, I notice that I still have unused provisions in my deck and start searching for more higher provision cards to grow the power of my deck. Wanting a bit more removal in my deck, I find Immelrith and Immelrith's Wrath and consider all the high power units in my deck, decide they are interesting choices to me. So I remove my remaining Wild Hunt Navigator, and again, looking for my least favorable cards to choose from, I also remove the Archespore. So far, I've only changed 3 cards, but my matches already feel much more powerful. I'm capable of removing more threats from my opponent while being able to get more points with my ghouls and Osril. I'm not super happy with my Archespore that I have left, and I notice I have 4 unused provisions. Knowing that I would likely choose my Archespore to remove before adding another card, I do the math and decide to look at 8 provision cards. It is always a good idea to use all available provisions when building a deck. I found a few interesting cards, and depending on which cards I have already or what I can craft with scraps, I decide to find an upgrade for Archespore. Goylet looks like another interesting large card which helps trigger my other cards' Thrive abilities, in addition to giving another option for my Osril. Chiron, on the other hand, would help me get Dominance by consuming up to 3 other units. It also serves as a nice way to consume the Harpy eggs in my deck, should I have them without a matching Harpy in my hand. Tatterwing serves as a similar purpose as Chiron, but allows me to get really nice value out of units when they are damaged. This is because he consumes at base power instead of current power. Ada Striga would add yet another powerful removal option to me, making the deck more removal oriented. Toad Prince seems like another valid removal option for smaller engines. All of these choices would improve my deck's performance relative to when I had an Archespore in my deck. Provisions are a great tool in identifying such opportunities. In this case, I choose Tatterwing to help improve my ability to not only consume eggs, but to recoup lost power of damaged units like Old Speartip. Depending on what you get through kegs or what you can afford to craft, the best option to start modifying a starter deck is to find some higher provision cards and swap out some of your cheaper bronzes out like I've done so far. In addition, as you play, you should keep an eye out for cards that feel like they fall short of what you want to accomplish in most matches. Just don't fall into the trap of thinking golds are always better. The synergy between your cards and the engine potential of some bronzes can be key to building a competitive deck. Thunderbolt Potion, for example, might easily feel underwhelming, and as we highlighted before, there are a few nice 8 provision alternatives to choose from to replace this card. In this case, I would replace it with Toad Prince, which I got in kegs earlier at some point. In this example, I would also recommend switching your leader ability to Force of Nature, thus allowing you to play even bigger lasses or even maybe protect your Ilmarith before you play him, making him harder to destroy. There are still many ways to tweak this deck by swapping cards around, but already it's much stronger than what we started with. For example of other ways to modify it, maybe you're finding your Harpy eggs to be too unreliable or not enough points, and you want to experiment with something else. Be careful though, as sometimes removing a card can impact the playability of other cards in your deck. In this case, Abaya and Kalino Harpy make much less sense in this deck as they lose their last remaining Death Wish target. However, removing these cards opens you to evolving your deck even more. For example, with them gone, you can now add Drowners, which acts as a soft removal for any engine cards that require to stay in a specific row. Kikimora Worker can be added to give more targets for a ghoul in later rounds. Parasite can replace your Abaya to give you a new option to either remove a high unit or boost one of yours to help gain dominance. This is but one of the directions you can slowly transform a starter deck. We could have embraced Consumption and Death Wishes more, for example. In this scenario, we have a deck with many ways to remove your opponent's engines, while being able to have large points in very few cards. Because of this deck should fight as long as possible to win round 1, so that it can bleed opponents in round 2. It really thrives in a short, long round. Lastly, if you feel like you have found a cool deck that you're proud of, you can always share it using the export button. Conversely, if you're feeling lost or looking for some inspiration for a different type of deck, the GWENT deck library can be used to help find some new ideas.